The dust kicked up behind the old pickup truck as it rolled down the winding dirt road toward the Silver Creek Ranch. Inside the cab, Margaret Hayes clutched her bouquet of wildflowers so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her wedding dress, a simple cream-colored gown she'd sewn herself, stretched across her fuller figure. She'd never imagined her wedding day would feel like walking toward a firing squad. Thomas Brennan, the ranch foreman who'd driven her from town, glanced over with kind eyes. "Don't you worry none, Miss Margaret. The boss knows what he's doing. He always has." Margaret wanted to believe him, but the knot in her stomach only tightened as the ranch house came into view. Dozens of trucks and cars lined the property. It seemed like half the county had shown up for this spectacle. That's what it was, wasn't it? A spectacle. The great Jackson Cole, the wealthiest rancher in 3 states, marrying a woman he'd only met twice through letters arranged by his grandmother. The truck rolled to a stop in front of the main house, a sprawling structure of timber and stone that spoke of old money and older traditions. Margaret could see them now, the wedding guests assembled in the garden. Women in their finest dresses and men in pressed suits, all turning to look as she emerged from the vehicle. The whispers started immediately. She could see lips moving behind raised hands, eyes widening with poorly concealed shock. Margaret had known this would happen. She'd warned Jackson in her letters that she wasn't the petite, delicate woman society expected. She was broad-shouldered and thick-waisted, built for hard work rather than high society tea parties. He'd written back that character mattered more than appearance, that he needed a partner, not a decoration. Now, facing the reality of 100 judgmental stares, she wondered if he'd truly meant those words. "Is that her?" a woman's voice carried clearly across the lawn. "Good heavens, I thought his grandmother was joking about finding him a mail-order bride, but this." "Jackson Cole could have any woman in the state," a man added. "What possessed him to choose that?" Margaret felt her cheeks burning, but she lifted her chin and stepped forward. She'd survived worse than cruel whispers. Growing up poor in a mining town, losing her parents to typhoid, working her fingers bloody in factories to support her younger siblings, she'd endured trials that would break these pampered socialites. Thomas offered his arm, and she took it gratefully. As they walked toward the assembled guests, the crowd parted like water around a stone. Their faces ranged from pitying to disgusted, with only a few showing neutral curiosity. Margaret searched desperately for Jackson, the man she was about to marry, wondering if he was having second thoughts. Then she saw him, standing at the altar beneath an arch of white roses. Jackson Cole was everything his reputation suggested, tall and powerfully built, with sun-weathered skin and sharp gray eyes that had seen both triumph and hardship. He wore a black suit that fit him perfectly, looking every inch the cattle baron he was. At 42, he could have chosen from countless willing women. Instead, he'd written to his grandmother requesting help finding a wife who valued hard work and honesty over wealth and status. Their eyes met across the distance. Margaret braced herself for disappointment, for the flicker of regret that would confirm her worst fears. Instead, Jackson's stern face softened into something approaching relief. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and approval that steadied her shaking hands. "Folks," Jackson's deep voice cut through the whispers like a knife through butter. "I'd appreciate you showing some respect for my bride." The murmuring didn't stop, but it lowered to a dull hum. Margaret continued her walk down the makeshift aisle, every step feeling like a small victory against the judgment surrounding her. She'd come too far to turn back now. Her siblings were counting on the money Jackson had already sent, enough to keep them fed and housed for a year. Whatever happened next, she would face it with dignity. As she reached the altar, Jackson extended his hand. His grip was warm and firm, calloused from years of ranch work. "Miss Hayes," he said quietly, for her ears only, "thank you for coming." Reverend Matthews opened his Bible with trembling hands, clearly uncomfortable with the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Margaret stood beside Jackson, acutely aware of every eye upon them, every whispered comment that carried on the afternoon breeze. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat trickled down her spine beneath the heavy fabric of her dress. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice wavering slightly, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Jackson Cole and Margaret Hayes in holy matrimony." A woman's laugh, sharp and cruel, cut through the sacred words. "This is absolutely ridiculous," the voice declared. Margaret recognized her from photographs Jackson had sent, Vivian Blackwood, daughter of the neighboring ranch owner and Jackson's former fiancée. "Jackson, you can't seriously go through with this farce." Jackson's jaw tightened, but he didn't turn around. The Reverend cleared his throat and continued, but Vivian wasn't finished. She stood, her emerald dress shimmering in the sunlight, her perfect figure drawing appreciative glances from several men in attendance. "Look at her," Vivian said, gesturing dramatically toward Margaret. "She's not fit to be a rancher's wife. She probably can't even ride a horse without breaking its back." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Margaret felt something inside her begin to crack. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry, wouldn't give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break. But the cruelty was overwhelming, washing over her in waves that threatened to pull her under. "That's enough." Jackson's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made everyone fall silent. He still hadn't turned around, his eyes fixed firmly on Margaret's face. "Reverend, please continue." "Jackson," another voice called out. Charles Blackwood, Vivian's father, stood beside his daughter. "Be reasonable. You're making a mistake that will affect this ranch for generations. This woman doesn't belong in our world. Send her back where she came from, marry Vivian as you were supposed to, and we'll forget this ever happened." Margaret felt Jackson's hand tighten around hers. She looked up at him, expecting to see doubt, perhaps even agreement with the objections being raised. Instead, she saw something that surprised her, barely contained fury. His gray eyes had turned cold as winter steel, and a muscle jumped in his clenched jaw. "Reverend Matthews," Jackson said, his voice dangerously calm, "before we continue, I believe some things need to be made clear to our guests." He finally turned to face the assembled crowd, keeping Margaret's hand firmly in his. The gesture felt protective, possessive even, and it sent a strange warmth through her chest despite the hostile atmosphere. "You all came here today supposedly to celebrate a wedding," Jackson began, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him. "But what you've shown is the ugly truth about this community. You judge a woman you don't know based on nothing but her appearance. You mock her openly at what should be the happiest day of her life. You call yourselves good Christian folk, but where's your charity? Where's your kindness?" Vivian crossed her arms, her perfect lips curled into a sneer. "Don't lecture us about kindness, Jackson. We're trying to save you from making a terrible mistake. That woman is clearly only after your money." Margaret flinched at the accusation, and Jackson felt it. His expression hardened further. "You want to talk about money, Vivian? Let's talk about it. Miss Hayes here grew up in a mining camp where she and her siblings often went to bed hungry. When typhoid swept through and took her parents, she was 16 years old. She could have abandoned her 3 younger brothers and sisters to the orphanage. Instead, she worked 2 jobs in factories, 12 hours each, to keep them together. She learned to sew, to cook, to budget every penny. When her youngest brother needed medicine they couldn't afford, she sold everything she owned including her mother's wedding ring." The crowd had gone completely silent now, but Jackson wasn't done. He looked at Charles Blackwood with undisguised contempt. "You want to talk about what makes someone fit to be a rancher's wife? Miss Hayes can birth a calf, mend a fence, balance accounts, and cook for 20 men without breaking a sweat. She's nursed sick children through scarlet fever and negotiated with bill collectors who wanted to take everything her family had left. She survived things that would break most of the pampered people standing here." Margaret stared at Jackson in shock. How did he know all of this? She'd mentioned some of it in her letters, but not in such detail. She'd certainly never told him about selling her mother's ring. That memory was too painful to share with a stranger. "My grandmother," Jackson continued, his voice softening slightly as he glanced at an elderly woman sitting in the front row, "spent 3 months corresponding with Miss Hayes. She investigated her character thoroughly, not because she doubted her, but because she wanted to know what kind of woman she was recommending to her grandson. Every letter spoke of integrity, resilience, and genuine kindness. Those are the qualities I need in a wife. Those are the qualities this ranch needs in its mistress." He turned back to Margaret, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch: respect, admiration, and perhaps the beginnings of something deeper. Miss Hayes could have lied about who she was. She could have sent photographs that didn't show her true appearance. Instead, she was honest about everything. "She told me she wasn't beautiful by society's standards." Jackson's voice grew stronger, projecting across the stunned silence that had fallen over the crowd like a heavy blanket. He hadn't released Margaret's hand, and now he raised it slightly, as if presenting her to a jury that had already passed judgment without seeing the evidence. "You want to know why I chose Margaret Hayes?" Jackson continued, his gray eyes blazing with an intensity that Margaret had never seen directed at her before. "Because I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of shallow conversations about weather and fashion while the real work of running this ranch falls to men like Thomas and the other hands who actually understand what it means to build something that lasts." He looked directly at Vivian, who had paled beneath her carefully applied rouge. "Vivian, you're beautiful. No one here would dispute that. But in the 5 years we were engaged, you visited this ranch exactly 12 times. Each visit lasted no more than 2 hours. You refused to set foot in the barn because of the smell. You complained about the dust, the heat, the isolation. You made it clear that once we were married, we'd spend most of our time in Denver or San Francisco, anywhere but here on the land that's been in my family for 3 generations." Vivian's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Her father's face had turned an alarming shade of red, but Jackson pressed on relentlessly. "When my foreman's wife had complications during childbirth last winter, I needed someone who could help. I sent word to you, Vivian, asking if you could come assist or at least provide comfort. You sent back a note saying you couldn't possibly travel in such weather and that medical matters were beneath your station." Jackson's voice dropped to a deadly quiet. The woman died because help came too late. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, and she left behind a husband and 2 small children. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes, not for herself but for this woman she'd never met and the family torn apart by loss. "I wrote to Miss Hayes about it," Jackson said, glancing at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "I didn't ask for advice or help. I just needed to tell someone who might understand the guilt I felt. Do you know what she did?" He paused, and Margaret remembered that letter. She'd cried reading it, feeling the raw pain in Jackson's words as he blamed himself for not having someone at the ranch with medical knowledge. "She wrote me a 10-page letter," Jackson continued, detailing everything she'd learned about childbirth and complications from helping deliver dozens of babies in her mining camp. She included drawings, instructions, warnings about danger signs. She created a medical manual because she never wanted me to feel that helpless again. She didn't know me. We'd only exchanged 3 letters at that point. But she took the time to help a stranger because it was the right thing to do." Thomas, the foreman, stepped forward from where he'd been standing at the back. His weathered face was set in grim lines. "It's true," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Boss showed me that letter. We copied it and gave it to every ranch in the county. 3 women's lives have been saved because of what Miss Hayes taught us. Including my sister's, just 2 months ago." The mood in the crowd was shifting now. Some faces showed shame, others confusion, but the open mockery had disappeared. Margaret could hardly process what was happening. This proud, powerful man was defending her not just with words but with evidence, with testimony that painted her as something other than the desperate fortune hunter they'd assumed. Charles Blackwood, however, wasn't ready to concede defeat. "That's all very touching, Jackson, but it doesn't change facts. Your grandmother is elderly and obviously made a poor judgment call. This woman doesn't have the breeding, the education, or the social standing to be the wife of someone in your position. Think about your children, about the legacy you'll leave them." Jackson's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Children? Let me tell you about children, Charles. When I wrote to Miss Hayes describing the kind of wife I wanted, I included something I've never told anyone else. I can't father children. A riding accident when I was 23 left me sterile. The doctors confirmed it years ago." The revelation sent shock waves through the assembled guests. Margaret herself felt her knees weaken with surprise. Jackson had never mentioned this in his letters, though now she understood why he'd asked repeatedly if she would be willing to help raise orphaned or fostered children. "I told Vivian this truth 2 years ago," Jackson said, his voice heavy with old pain. "She called off our engagement immediately. Said there was no point in marrying if there wouldn't be heirs to combine our family fortunes. That's when I knew that everything between us had been about money and land, never about partnership or love." Vivian's face had gone from pale to flushed with humiliation. "That's not fair, Jackson. A marriage needs children. It's not wrong to want." "I told Miss Hayes the same truth in my second letter to her," Jackson interrupted. "Do you know what she wrote back?" He finally turned fully to Margaret, and she saw moisture gathering in his eyes. Her own vision had gone blurry with tears she could no longer hold back. "She said that children are a blessing but not the only purpose of a marriage. She said that if God willed it, we could provide a home for children who needed one, and if He didn't, we could build a life of purpose together regardless. She said she'd learned from her own childhood that family is built through love and commitment, not just blood." Margaret nodded, remembering that letter. She'd agonized over how to respond to his confession, wanting to be honest but not wanting to seem desperate. In the end, she'd simply written from her heart. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the garden where the wedding guests stood frozen in various states of discomfort and shame. Margaret watched as Jackson's words settled over the crowd like snow, covering the ugliness that had been so openly displayed with a cold blanket of truth. But Jackson wasn't finished. He'd spent years building his reputation as a fair but firm man, someone who could be ruthless when necessary but always just. Now he turned that same unwavering focus on the community that had gathered to witness what they'd expected to be a humiliating spectacle. "I want every person here to understand something," Jackson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "When I stand before God and Reverend Matthews today and pledge my life to Margaret Hayes, I'm doing so with full knowledge of who she is. I know she's been mocked for her weight since childhood. I know she's been passed over for jobs because employers wanted pretty girls at their counters instead of capable ones. I know she's heard every cruel joke and suffered every slight that small-minded people can devise." He paused, scanning the faces before him with penetrating intensity. "What you don't know is that 3 months ago, I came to her town in secret. I wanted to see her for myself, not just read her words on paper. I didn't announce who I was. I just watched." Margaret's head whipped toward him in surprise. "He'd done what?" Jackson gave her hand a gentle squeeze but kept his attention on the crowd. "I saw her working at a laundry, carrying loads that made my ranch hands look lazy. I saw her give her lunch to a child who'd been sent to work without food. I saw her defend a Chinese worker from men who were throwing rocks and insults. She got hit herself, took a stone to the shoulder that left a bruise I could see from across the street, but she didn't back down until those cowards slunk away." The elderly woman in the front row, Jackson's grandmother, was nodding with a satisfied smile. She'd clearly known about this investigation, probably encouraged it. "That evening," Jackson continued, "I followed her home to a boarding house that should have been condemned years ago. I watched her climb 3 flights of stairs carrying water for washing. Through the thin walls, I heard her reading to her siblings, helping them with lessons even though she was exhausted. I heard her singing them to sleep with a voice that was actually quite beautiful. And then I heard her crying quietly after they were asleep, crying from pain and tiredness and the crushing weight of responsibility she'd carried for 6 years." Margaret felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that was almost unbearable. These intimate details of her life, laid bare before strangers who'd already judged her and found her wanting. But Jackson's thumb rubbed gentle circles on the back of her hand, anchoring her. "I went back to my hotel that night and wrote her a letter," Jackson said, his voice softening. "I didn't mail it for 2 weeks because I wanted to be sure I wasn't acting on impulse or pity. But what I felt wasn't pity. It was awe. Here was a woman who'd been dealt every bad hand life could offer, yet she hadn't become bitter or cruel. She'd remained kind, generous, hardworking. She was exactly the kind of person I wanted to build a life with." Old Mrs. Cole, Jackson's grandmother, struggled to her feet with the help of her cane. At 87, she was the matriarch of the Cole family and one of the most respected women in the county. When she spoke, people listened. "You're all fools," she declared in a voice that was surprisingly strong for her age. "Every last one of you. I've watched this community decline for 20 years, becoming more concerned with appearances than substance. We used to value hard work and integrity. Now we worship beauty and wealth like golden calves." She fixed Vivian with a stare that could have melted steel. "Girl, you had your chance and you threw it away because you wanted a life of ease and luxury. You didn't want a partner, you wanted a bank account with a handsome face attached. Well, Jackson deserves better than that, and so does this ranch." Turning to her grandson, Mrs. Cole's expression softened into something approaching tenderness. "When your grandfather married me 65 years ago, folks laughed at him too. Said I was too old at 26, too plain, too opinionated. Said I'd never give him strong sons or manage his household properly. Your grandfather told them all to go to hell and married me anyway." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but Mrs. Cole wasn't smiling. "We built this ranch together from nothing. Every fence post, every head of cattle, every decision, we were partners. That's what a marriage should be. And from everything I learned about Margaret Hayes, she has exactly what it takes to be that kind of partner." Charles Blackwood, who'd been growing increasingly uncomfortable, made one last attempt to salvage his position. "This is all very emotional, but emotion doesn't run a ranch. Jackson, you're letting your heart override your head. What happens when the novelty wears off and you're stuck with a wife who embarrasses you at social functions? What happens when you need to negotiate deals with men who won't respect you because why?" Jackson's voice cracked like a whip. "Because my wife doesn't meet their arbitrary standards of beauty? Charles, I've been negotiating with men like that my entire life. Men who judge everything on surface appearance and miss what actually matters. Those men always lose in the end because they're so busy looking at the facade that they don't see the foundation crumbling beneath their feet. He turned to address the entire assembly once more. Let me make something absolutely clear. Margaret Hayes will be my wife in every sense of the word. She will manage this household and have complete authority over domestic matters. She will be treated with the respect due to Mrs. Jackson Cole by everyone who works on this ranch or does business with me. Anyone who has a problem with that can leave now, and they won't be welcome back. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. Even those who'd been most vocally critical seemed to understand that Jackson had drawn a line in the sand, and crossing it would have serious consequences. Reverend Matthews, who'd been standing frozen throughout the entire confrontation, finally found his voice again. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should continue with the ceremony. Jackson nodded curtly and turned back to face the altar, once again taking Margaret's hands in his. She looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes, trying to process everything that had just happened. This man, this powerful stranger, had defended her with a fierceness that no one in her entire life had ever shown. He'd laid bare his own vulnerabilities, exposed private truths, all to shield her from the cruelty of people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered but somehow did. Jackson, she whispered, her voice trembling. You didn't have to do all that. Yes, he said simply, I did. They needed to understand that you're not a consolation prize or a desperate choice. You're exactly who I want. The Reverend began reading from his Bible again, the familiar words of the marriage ceremony washing over them like a benediction. Margaret tried to focus on the vows, on the magnitude of what she was about to promise, but her mind kept replaying Jackson's words. He'd investigated her in secret. He'd seen her at her worst, exhausted, bruised, crying from loneliness and fear. And he'd still chosen her. Do you, Jackson Cole, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? I do. Jackson's voice was firm and clear, with no hesitation whatsoever. And do you, Margaret Hayes, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? Margaret looked into Jackson's gray eyes and saw her future there. It wouldn't be easy, nothing in her life had ever been easy. There would be challenges ahead, people who would never accept her, moments when she'd doubt herself and wonder if she truly belonged in this world of wealth and status. But she'd faced worse odds before and survived. More than that, she'd triumphed. I do, she said, and her voice was stronger than she'd expected. Reverend Matthews smiled with genuine warmth for the first time that afternoon. Then by the power vested in me by God and the state of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jackson, you may kiss your bride. Jackson leaned down, and Margaret rose on her tiptoes to meet him. The kiss was gentle, almost chaste, but there was a promise in it that made her heart race. This was real. This was happening. She was Margaret Cole now, wife to one of the most powerful men in the territory. When they turned to face the crowd as husband and wife, the applause was scattered and uncertain at first. Then Thomas started clapping loudly, and other ranch hands joined in. Mrs. Cole was beaming and nodding her approval. Gradually, more people began to clap, though some faces still showed disapproval or confusion. Vivian Blackwood had disappeared at some point during the ceremony, Margaret noticed. Her father remained, his expression stony, but he gave a curt nod of acknowledgement before turning and walking toward his carriage. Others followed his lead, departing quietly without the congratulations or celebration typical of a wedding. Margaret felt a pang of sadness watching them go. She'd hoped, foolishly perhaps, that Jackson's defense might change some minds. But people's prejudices ran deep, she knew that. They wouldn't transform overnight just because a man had spoken passionately about his bride's character. Don't worry about them, Jackson murmured, seeming to read her thoughts. The ones who matter are staying. He was right. About half the original assembly remained, and these were the working ranchers, the merchants who actually ran their businesses rather than just owning them, the families who understood that survival in this harsh territory required strength of character over prettiness of face. They formed a line to offer congratulations, and Margaret shook hands until her arm ached. Mrs. Cole pulled her aside while Jackson was talking to his ranch hands. You're wondering if you made a mistake, the old woman said bluntly. If marrying a man you barely know was foolish. Margaret started to protest, but Mrs. Cole waved her hand dismissively. Don't bother denying it. I'd think you were stupid if you weren't having doubts. But let me tell you something about my grandson. He's stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery when he thinks he's right about something. He's also the most loyal man you'll ever meet. Once he's committed to something, or someone, he doesn't quit. Ever. I don't want him to feel trapped, Margaret admitted quietly. I don't want him to wake up one day and regret this. The old woman laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. Child, Jackson spent 6 months researching you before ever writing that first letter. He read reports from private investigators, talked to people who knew you, studied your character like a general studying a battlefield. That man doesn't do anything without thorough planning. If he wanted out, he'd have found a way before the wedding, not after. What you saw today wasn't obligation or stubbornness. That was a man defending what he values most. A warm glow spread through Margaret's chest at those words. She wanted to believe them, wanted to trust that this wasn't all some elaborate charity or misguided sense of duty on Jackson's part. The reception that followed was modest compared to what had originally been planned. The elaborate 5-course dinner was simplified, and the orchestra had packed up and left with the departing guests. But what remained felt more genuine. People laughed and talked without the stiffness of formal society. Ranch hands danced with townswomen. Children ran around the garden chasing fireflies as evening fell. Jackson found Margaret standing alone near the rose arbor, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. It was the first truly intimate gesture between them, and Margaret stiffened briefly before forcing herself to relax into his embrace. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For seeing me. The real me. Not just what I look like on the outside." Jackson rested his chin on top of her head. "Margaret, I need you to understand something. I didn't marry you despite your appearance. I married you because of everything you are. That includes your body, which has worked hard and carried heavy burdens and survived things that would have broken someone weaker. When I look at you, I see strength. I see resilience. I see beauty that goes far deeper than skin." Tears slipped down Margaret's cheeks, but they were good tears this time. Healing tears. "I'm going to disappoint you sometimes," she warned. "I don't know anything about managing a household this size. I've never hosted a dinner party or organized staff. I'm going to make mistakes." "Good," Jackson said, surprising her. "I don't want perfection. I want a partner who's willing to learn, willing to try, willing to fail and get back up. That's what builds character. That's what creates a real partnership." They stood there as darkness fell, wrapped in each other's arms, while around them the simple celebration continued. It wasn't the wedding Margaret had dreamed about as a girl. There had been no fairy tale romance, no dramatic declaration of love. But there was something better: respect, honesty, and the foundation for something that might, with time and effort, grow into love. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Margaret Cole looked up at her new husband and smiled. "I'm ready," she said. "For whatever comes next, I'm ready." Jackson smiled back, a genuine expression that transformed his stern face. "Then let's go home, Mrs. Cole. We have a life to build together." And hand in hand, they walked toward the ranch house that would become their home, leaving behind the judgment and cruelty of people who'd never understood that true worth isn't measured in pounds or dollars, but in the strength of one's character and the capacity of one's heart.